I mean, I know these are controversial and it's emotional because we're all so committed to this. So, you know, I understand we do want to discuss it. Let me move on. I think, so as I say, a lot of this rests on the assumption that when somebody comes to us, you know, we just need to look, and if we could just find the right way of looking at it, we crack the problem. I think and so we just need to look, if we can't look at the form, we'll look at them in more detail, do other tests, and we'll find, you know, we'll get to the real true sort of measure of them. But what that fails to recognise is the huge effect that socioeconomic advantage has had prior to this point. And so we start, you know, we know that people who from socioeconomic, more privileged backgrounds are likely to go to a more high-performing school, get higher A-level grades, if you get higher A-level grades, you're more likely to go to a high-tariff university. Degree class is less of a strong association, but certainly your degree class is influenced by a number of factors related to socioeconomic advantage. Master's degrees, we know, cost £10,000 to do, plus your lost earnings while you're doing them. So it's clear that socioeconomic advantage has a role to play in whether you're able to do a master's course. Voluntary experience, whether you can afford to do it, whether you've got connections to get voluntary experience, has a significant role to play. And when we look at assistant psychologists, post or paid experience, these things have an effect through the way that they're sort of one leads to another, but then they all come into play. I've been a service head in London. When I recruited for assistant psychologists, I capped it at 400 applications. We usually took about less than a week to get to that point. And of course, so actually they have more of a problem than we do when they're looking through forms. And of course, what do? They use the easy ways to do it. They look at, you know, high class degree, good university, to whittle it down. And then, you know, so they're doing part of this for us. So that they're already, you know, contributing to this. The opposite's the case for disadvantage. If you start off with disadvantage, you're likely to go to a less well-performing school, get lower A-level grades. There's plenty of information about this. Vicky Bolivar has looked at this is all pupils, private school pupils in terms of decile of A-level grades. So only 2% of pupils on free school meals get AA, B or better, compared to 13% of private school educated pupils. And that varies actually within private schools. I think I'll show you this actually. So this is by school. This is, as I mentioned, there's about 3,000 schools within England. And their rate of percentage of pupils getting AAB varies really quite dramatically. The most common, over 700 schools, 0 to 3.6% of pupils get 0 to 3.6% of pupils get AAB. Whereas you've got schools up here, where 80% of pupils get AAB. So schools are dramatic differences in terms of their educational outcomes. This is another way of looking at schools. If you look at the average UKCAS points of a pupil coming out of the average UKCAS points of pupils leaving schools actually follows quite a nice normal distribution that we like to see as psychologists. So most schools have their average pupil between 690 and 700 points. Just before I left Oxford, I did this data is available for schools each year, their average performance. I looked at the schools our applicants went to in Oxford, and the distribution of them. And you know, maybe that's different in Oxford now, maybe different in your courses. You might want to check. But you know, only one. This is one single applicant went to a lower than average performing school, and I would put money on the fact that your distribution won't look significantly different to this. So if you think people are equal by the time they get there, it's really not the case. There are people with lower A-level grades and people from ethnic minorities, and this was true, this is highlighted in Graham's report, are more likely to go to a new university. We know this from UKCAS data. Disadvantaged pupils going to high tariff university, that's about 3%. Advantaged pupils, about 25% going to high tariff universities. Lower degree class, socioeconomic advantage is associated with lower degree class. This is again the HESA data. This is the proportion of psychology graduates by ethnic background who get a first class degree. White psychology undergraduates, 18% get a first class degree. Asian, about 9%, black, 4.8%, I think. So these are starkly different outcomes. So I mean, this isn't obviously it's not, it's an issue that goes back right through the educational pathway. So if you work out these figures, that means that of those 18,000 people who did an undergraduate degree in that year, given the proportion of people who are black, that represents about 40 people in the whole of England or UK, black students who got a first-class degree. So we're talking about tiny numbers. This has a big effect. So if we're fishing in a pool of looking for first-class graduates, we're fishing in a very, very small pool.
It's very similar to the success rate profile, isn't it? It's within a few couple of
You've seen this somewhere before, exactly. It's I think more than a coincidence, isn't it? It's I think that's a really good observation. So white British psychology students were 3.5 times more likely to be awarded a first-class degree. So by the time people get to us, their backgrounds are not in any way similar. Leaving university, your socioeconomic background has a significant effect on what you're able to do. You may well need to take a paid job, in which you're more likely to get a care assistant job than psychology assistant job. Back in 1993, Mary Moore did a survey that found people from ethnic minorities backgrounds were underrepresented in assistant psychologist posts, despite even at that time them being overrepresented in people applying. So people are applying with different backgrounds in terms of work experience. They get to the point of filling in the form, and again, these factors affect the people that people can rely on for references, and I have a big problem with the way we use references. Certainly the reference name should be blind, the form should be blind, the reference name should be blind, because people from ethnic minority backgrounds are less likely to have a clinical psychologist as a referee or a big name as a referee. It's unbelievable that we use the name of referee in any way in our process.
We don't use references at all in
well,
our ratings.
You're ahead.
We don't either.
We don't.
Oh, we don't.
Yeah.
Prior work experience.
Well, some of the things that you're already ticking the boxes for. You do, once you get to this point, then certainly the perception of tests is that, and certainly companies advertise that you can pay to practice doing tests. I don't know what test. This is specifically for doctoral clinical psychology, and it's got 103 reviews that are 4.4 stars. This is £49 to join this, to practice your tests. And so, economic advantage comes in at that point as well.
The same is true for the application forms, of course. You can get places that will help you.
Right. It comes in. That's right. Absolutely, it comes in so many different ways, doesn't it? Now, there's a limit to what we can do about this. But what I would argue is that if we look at a form and then look at A-level grade and say, oh look, this person's got high A-level grades. Then we look at the same form and then say, oh look, we'll give them some extra credit because they went to a Russell Group University or Oxbridge. Then say, oh look, they've got a master's degree. What we're actually doing is just holding magnifying glasses on that socioeconomic advantage. And Kathy can look very smart because you're not doing this, but some courses unbelievably are, giving people separate credit.
Yeah, it's interesting that if we look at the data for socioeconomic advantage, that doesn't make a difference at the point of screening with GMA tests, but interview it does.
Yeah.
So
I don't know, if you're measuring socioeconomic advantage on Polar, that's not a good measure of socioeconomic.
Using the clearinghouse data.
Are you using IMD?
We're just using the clearinghouse data. I don't know.
So that's Polar, yeah. So in fact, there's a much better way to look at socioeconomic using postcode as well. I'll come on to
we don't use postcode.
But you use Polar, right? That Polar's
Polar
not.
data is what they're providing, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. But that's actually not a measure of socioeconomic deprivation. Nobody would use it as a measure of socioeconomic deprivation.
Is that what the clearinghouse provides?
Yeah, it's a measure of participation in education. So there are other things we can look at, which I'll come on to in a second. So
that sounds like a really big issue that we need to address.
But I think that is something we could do. There are other databases based on postcode. But we have the postcode, so actually using other measures of postcode is a way that we could. But just coming back to those, putting the magnifying glasses on socioeconomic advantage, given what we know about A-level grades in particular, and that if we already have information on people's performance on a psychology degree, I would argue that if you're using non-contextualized A-level grades in any way in your, I know a number of you aren't, or type of university attended, in any way in your admissions process, it's not, I guess for some reason it's not coming up. I think I didn't. It's supposed to review it. Basically, it says that you're actually making things worse. I mean, you're not only are you not helping, you're actually making things worse, and you're actually may well be you're acting against increased participation programs which use contextualised A-level grades, and you may well, so you're acting against that, and you may well be acting against the participation program in your own university. Because a lot of universities now are using contextual factors, including the University of Oxford, which is leading the way, I think, in this. So I would argue that we'd be looking hard at applicants, but looking in the wrong direction. I would say a lot of our focus is looking backward on attainment, or even backwards, or you could say currently in terms of measuring tests. But what we need to do is look forward and identify potential. And to do this, we need to level the playing field. There's no point in just looking at people in isolation. We need to look at the holistic context. You've probably seen this diagram about equality, so treating everybody equally, equity, where you try and sort of apportion things more fairly, justly. And I'm afraid where we are in terms of is reality, which I think you could quite strongly argue we are in clinical psychology, where socioeconomic advantage but some applicants, way streets ahead of others who are sort of way behind. So we need to find ways to minimise the impact of this if possible, and then actually try and level the playing field if possible. So there are indicators of advantage. I'm conscious I've talked for longer than I said I would, although perhaps if you count the pauses I haven't. So we can look at the socioeconomic advantage, we can measure it in different ways. So we've just been talking about the POLAR, which is a measure of participation in higher education. As I mentioned, in London, that's actually higher than in some other areas of the country, but all it measures is what percentage of people from that postcode access higher education. So it's not used as a measure of socioeconomic deprivation. Other measures are ACORN, but the best one is the Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a publicly government available database which uses multiple deprivation indices. There's a website, you just type the code in, and it generates a decile of the country in terms of deprivation. So that is another alternative that we could use. I mean, we don't use POLAR in selection, and I don't think many courses do at the moment, but IMD you could do. But again, they're still based on an area, so it's saying everybody in a particular area is the same, which is clearly not the case. What you can do is also look at the school someone attended, and that does tell you something, and we do have a lot of information available from sort of publicly available database about performance of schools. So I mean, the first thing is state versus selective. You can find out about, but you can also do the data I mentioned earlier about average UKCAT points of someone from that school, and as I've shown you, it varies dramatically. And then the best type of information is obviously about an individual. This is a bit more difficult because it's less verifiable, but we use self-reported information in terms of disability as it is, but the sorts of things you could use are means tested benefits, free school meals. Again, Vicky Bolivar did a review of the types of different indicators that you can use, and the one with the best sensitivity and specificity is free school meal status. Care leaver, refugee, carer, first generation to attend university. So this is Bolivar's review of how universities are using this, and this is the top 30 universities, and most of the top 30 universities say they use it in some way in their undergraduate admissions, including probably some of your universities. And they use it in different ways, but increasingly universities are using this to prioritise, to be proactive, to offer interviews to people, or to offer to give people a standard offer, or this is the column for people giving a reduced entry, 1 grade reduction, 2 grade reduction offer based on contextual information.
That's the index of multiple deprivation.
This is using both area but also school and individual. So I'll show you some examples of how this is used, but it's certainly not just using area. I don't think anyone would just use area information. So if you want to read more, I did print off a couple of these to give you, but it's very widely available. The Office for Students, the newly formed, relatively still newly formed Office for Students, has done, has set very challenging targets for increased participation from people from less advantaged backgrounds, and is very clear that the only way to achieve those targets is by using context. And in May, they produced a newsletter which says promoting fairness and rethinking merit. And you'll find a lot of these ideas discussed in there if you haven't already seen it. How it might be used in an this is, I mean, looking at somebody's background, this is what somebody in an undergraduate admissions office would see. And, you know, obviously there are some differences for us, but you would see someone's A-level grades, in our case, C degree class as well, and you'd have flags based on postcode for most deprived decile, or you know, however you want to set it, and also schools below the national average. And for someone else, you'd see their A-levels in context of their address and the school they attended. So one of the things you might go through your mind is that if we don't take the brightest students, they won't be able to cope. And also you might say A-level grades have been shown to be a predictor of performance. What I'd say about that is that this is based on, obviously those studies are based on regression analysis of what's happened in the past. And you know, what I think we're wanting to know is what could happen in the future rather than what has happened in the past. If you did a regression analysis for people who became doctors 50 years ago, you could put, you know, gender, social class in them, and you'd find great predictive models, but you wouldn't want to replicate them. So models that say, oh, you know, we've had good, you know, prediction from A-level grades are, you know, looking back. We need to be looking forward.
They only last a year as well, don't they, those predictive factors associated with A-level grades? For medical school data, it shows it only lasts a year.
Right. And I'm going to show you some data from Southampton where actually participation programmes find that that relationship doesn't hold up. So Southampton has a really good, sort of seen as a groundbreaking participation programme. So I'm moving on now, I should just flag this up. So contextual factors are used widely now, and increasingly so, in the way that shortlisting is done for undergraduate admissions. Other universities are providing additional support to people who've come through a contextual admission process, and this Southampton programme gives medical students an additional year as foundation year for people who've come through this route. And the criteria for this route are first generation in higher education, means tested benefits. You don't have to have all of these. Any of these are flags or criteria. Looked after children, free school meals, and postcode. So I can't remember exactly how they combine these, but those are the sorts of things they're looking at, putting people into these programmes.
And if they have an extra year of training, do they?
A whole
too?
extra year, yeah.
Yes.
So this is at
Okay.
the point
So
of
it's
leaving
big
school.
funding
So I'm
issue there.
sure. I'm not suggesting we could talk about this, but this is what's possible, I guess, is what I'm flagging up. If you look, this is UKCAT, which is a test that's used. I know this because my son's a medical student now, and he went through the two different tests they used. One of them is UKCAT. And this is the standard medical students UKCAT score. This is their participation programme UKCAT score. In the past, they found that UKCAT score predicts first year performance, because it's quite a sort of good predictive relationship of overall students UKCAT and first year. I can't even remember what FPM stands for. However, when you look at the participation programme students, in fact, there's no relationship whatsoever between their UKCAT scores, because the UKCAT scores has said something about where they've come from, not where they're going. Similar foundation year is, I mentioned Oxford. Louise Richardson has been a great promoter of access and participation in Oxford. Lady Margaret Hall, one of the colleges in Oxford, has a similar kind of participation programme. Again, this is another foundation year, so after leaving school, people have a year before they start a degree programme. These are the criteria for that: state school, household income, socioeconomic, based on, they look at parental occupation and also home fees. So these are the sorts of things. Notice none of these use ethnicity, even though the outcome is actually increasing diversity in terms of ethnicity, but none of them use that as a criteria. So, but you might say, well, what's the legal, using contextual factors, surely that's against the law. We know that some protected characteristics are against the law to use. You'll notice none of those contextual factors are protected characteristics, which is not completely by chance. But so I thought, well, let's check this out. So I went to the Law Society to find out, what can we do? Isn't this against the law? So I went to the Law Society, and their motto is, I can't say because it's in Latin, and I didn't do Latin at school, but the translation is, we observe the laws and ordinances. So at least I think they probably don't win the prize for the catchiest logo. But what they do win the prize for is being proactive. So what they gave me is their contextual recruitment for solicitors into the legal profession, because the legal profession recognise that they have a problem with diversity in the legal profession for solicitors and barristers. So this is not just undergraduate admissions, this is looking at post-university profession. And so I brought a copy with me. January 2016, they produced guidance for law firms to use contextual recruitment. What does it look like? This is just, I could cut this out of their booklet. They said, imagine you're looking at these application forms, these A-level grades, and your work experience. One has legal work experience, one doesn't. Who might you select? On the face of it, Jonathan might appear the stronger candidate, but let's add some supplementary information that puts Kate's achievement in context. So the supplementary information you're given here is that the school's average A-level result and the deprivation index of the postcode. Again, they're promoting contextual factors as a way of increasing the participation from people from different backgrounds. So they suggest a range of contextual factors that you would take into account. They say you should look at, this is obviously in their context, but they say you could ask these yes-no questions. Did either of your parents attend university? Did you get household income support, free school meals? Did you care for a parent, child or relative? Or at any time were you looked after by local authorities? So they're yes-no questions that you'd ask people, and they generate a flag. Then they say, well, just from those yes-no, you might, from those people, flag people up for further investigation, so then you might look at their school performance, so you put their A-level grades in context. And the same sort of thing that I've shown you earlier. This is being used now widely in legal firms. This is from 2018 October. Ropes and Gray launch innovative CV blind and contextual recruitment for trainee solicitors in London. Rare Recruitment are a firm that specialises in contextual recruitment and have been widely taken on in promoting access and diversity in the legal profession. They've now been adopted by 87% of the UK's top law firms, 27% of trainees entering legal solicitor training now have a flag, contextual flag. 6% of trainees are brought to interview because of their contextual flag. So if the legal profession could do it, we know it's not against the law. Their flag system are care leaver, bottom 40% school, free school meals, first generation. They don't use polar alone, they don't use ethnicity alone in rare recruitment. Deloitte, this is from 2015. Deloitte, this is in the Independent. Deloitte no longer wants to know where its job applicants studied. Again, blind interviews and using contextualised data. So accountancy firms, law firms are using contextualised data. So I'm going to finish now with my 5 recommendations for action. Stop making the problem worse by using uncontextualised A-level results and universities attended in shortlisting. Remove them from the application form completely. Stop spending time, effort and money on pre-selection tests in the hope of increasing diversity. Other people have tried it, it hasn't worked in other sectors. I've looked at the information in the data, I'll look at it again, you know, to look at individual courses, but I haven't seen anything that suggests that it's the answer in this response. We can discuss it further, but I haven't seen anything. No one else, other people have looked at tests with the same idea, and they have other medicine and other places, and they've moved away from it. You know, it's not working in any other area as a way of increasing diversity. I would suggest that we, you know, look at it a bit more carefully maybe, but I would think it's very unlikely to be the answer. What is the answer, or has some hope of being the answer, is using contextual information in application forms. We could include free school meals, refugee status, care leaver status, secondary school performance, parental income, and IMD. If the law firms are using this, we've known about this problem for 15 years or more. If accountancy firms and law firms are using this information, and we're supposed to be a caring psychological profession, why the hell are we not doing it? I told you I might get emotional. It's not good enough just to collect it, obviously, we want to monitor it, but we need to use it proactively as a part of a fairer, more holistic shortlisting process. And if we do that, we can't then just wash our hands. We need to provide appropriate support and mentoring before and during training. We have the advantage that we do our selection typically before Easter. People then start in September. We don't know it's an if, but if additional support was needed for people who come through a contextual admissions route, then we've got plenty of time to provide it. We don't need to delay them a year. We can do stuff to provide. So we've done stuff at the moment in terms of mentoring in the London programme. I would suggest that if we do it on a broad level before selection, it's not going to affect the shortlisting process, and also it's not targeting the people who are most likely to benefit from it. I would suggest that we do it after we do contextual selection. So that's my recommendations for action. There's some more references there. I'll again put this on the Dropbox that I'll set up. Look, the Law Society report I mentioned, Fair Education Alliance, Vicky Bolivar's work, the Office for Students, and Universities UK have recently published a report on reducing the attainment gap for black and minority ethnic students. So diversify ClinSci. I think it is possible, but we do need to think differently. Thank you.